My ex's mom showed me a photo at a party and asked, "Am I still beautiful?" What happened over the next changed both our lives.
This story is really good, and I want you to stay with me and listen to this whole story.
And I still don't know how to explain it to most people. That sentence right there. That's where this whole thing starts. Not with some grand romantic moment. Not with anything I planned. It starts with me standing in a kitchen at a party I almost didn't go to, holding a drink I didn't want, 3 weeks after the most quietly devastating breakup of my life, and a woman I barely knew tilting her phone toward my face and asking me something so simple it nearly broke me open right there next to the refrigerator. I'm going to tell you exactly what happened. All of it. And I need you to stay with me through the whole thing because if you leave early, you're going to miss the part that actually matters. So, here we go. My name is Callum. I'm 28 years old. And at the time this started, I was working as a project coordinator for a mid-sized construction management firm in Bozeman, Montana. Not glamorous. Not terrible. The kind of job where you show up, you solve problems other people created, and you go home tired in a way that has nothing to do with your body. My boss was a man named Renfield. Good boss, actually. Fair, direct, didn't waste your time. He had a big ranch-style house on the edge of town, and once or twice a year he'd throw these parties that were equal parts professional obligation and genuine hospitality. Good whiskey. Good food. Enough space that you could avoid whoever you needed to avoid. I almost skipped that one. I almost texted some excuse about being tired, which would have been true, and stayed home, which would have been easier. But something made me go. I don't know what. Maybe I was tired of sitting alone in my apartment staring at the wall thinking about Saoirse. Saoirse, my ex, 21 years old, full of energy, genuinely wonderful in a lot of ways that I still believe were real. She was Renfield's niece, which made everything about the breakup slightly more complicated than your average split. We'd been together for about 8 months. It ended 3 weeks before this party, quietly, without a single screaming match, which somehow made it worse. There's something about a breakup that ends in mutual sadness rather than anger that takes longer to process. Anger gives you something to push against. Sadness just sits there. So I went to the party. I put on a decent shirt. I drove to Renfield's house. I walked in, said the right things to the right people, laughed at a few things, and then found myself drifting toward the kitchen because that's what you do at parties when you're not really there. You drift toward wherever it's quieter. And that's when I saw her. Dana. I want to be careful about how I describe this moment because I've thought about it a lot since and I want to get it right. Dana was Saoirse's mother. I'd met her twice before, both times at family things I attended as Saoirse's boyfriend. She was 42, dark hair, the kind of composure that isn't cold. It's just earned. Both times I'd met her before, we exchanged the usual things you exchange when you're the boyfriend being assessed by the family. Polite, forgettable, fine. But tonight she looked different. I don't mean she looked different physically. I mean she looked like a person instead of a role. You know how sometimes you've only ever seen someone playing a part and then you catch them off guard and suddenly you realize there's an entire human being underneath all that? That's what it was. She was standing near the kitchen counter with a glass of red wine in one hand and her phone in the other, and there was something in her posture, something slightly nervous, that I'd never seen on her before. She saw me before I could redirect. And instead of the usual quick, polite nod, she actually moved toward me, set her wine glass on the counter, looked at me with this expression I couldn't read, and then she tilted her phone toward my face. It was a photo of herself. Recent, clearly. She was standing in a doorway somewhere, light coming from behind her, looking directly into the camera. And before I could even fully process what I was looking at, she asked me, quietly, almost like she was asking herself more than me, "Am I still beautiful?" 3 seconds. That's how long I stood there saying nothing. And I want you to understand what those 3 seconds felt like because they matter. It wasn't awkwardness exactly. It was more like the moment when someone says something so honest and so unguarded in a room full of performance that your brain has to catch up to what just happened. Here was a woman who, by any measure you could think of, had no reason to be asking that question. And she was asking it anyway, genuinely, with her whole nervous self right there on the surface. And I told her the truth. Not a compliment, not a reassurance. The truth. I looked at the photo and then I looked at her and I said yes, and not just in the photo, I told her the photo barely got it right because the more striking thing was the way she was standing in a room full of people who were all working very hard to be noticed, and she wasn't working at all and she was still the most present person there. She stared at me for a moment. Then something in her face softened. Not in a dramatic way. More like something that had been held tight for a long time just slightly released. She laughed a little. Small laugh. And she said she'd taken 43 versions of that photo before she'd kept one. I said that was the saddest and most relatable thing I'd heard all year. She looked at me like she wasn't sure if I was being funny or honest. I was being both. We started talking. And I mean really talking, the kind that happens when two people accidentally drop the script at the same time and neither of them picks it back up. She asked how I was doing, and not in the party way where the expected answer is fine. In the actual way. And I told her I'd been better. She nodded like she understood that specific feeling of being technically fine and genuinely not. She said she'd been living in that zip code for a while herself. She didn't bring up Saoirse first. I did, eventually, carefully. I told her I was sorry if things had been complicated on her end. She looked at me and said something I've thought about many times since. She said, she loved her daughter completely, but she also had eyes, and she could see how things between us had gone, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise just to make conversation comfortable. That was the moment I realized I was talking to someone who didn't perform. We stood in that kitchen for 2 hours. The party moved around us like water around two rocks. People came in, grabbed things from the fridge, left, came back. At some point Renfield walked through, looked at us, did a slight double take and kept walking. I noticed that. I filed it away. By the time I got to my car that night, it was past midnight. I sat there for a few minutes before starting the engine. Not because anything had happened. Nothing had happened. We just talked. But something about the conversation was sitting in my chest in a way I didn't fully understand yet, and I wasn't ready to drive away from it. I drove home on dark Montana roads thinking about a woman who took 43 photos of herself and still wasn't sure she was beautiful. And about the way she'd looked at me when I told her the truth. Like it had been a while since someone had looked directly at her and meant what they said. I didn't know what that meant yet. I didn't let myself think about what it might mean. I just drove home, went to bed, stared at the ceiling for a while, and told myself it was just a good conversation at a party and that was all it was and I should get some sleep. I didn't sleep. And here's the first twist in this story, the one that still makes my stomach drop when I think about it. The next morning, Renfield called me into a quick stand-up meeting about a site delay. Normal Monday energy. At the end he said, almost casually, Dana mentioned she had a good conversation with you Saturday night. Said you were kind to her. My heart did something illegal in my chest. I said, yeah, we talked for a while in the kitchen. She seemed like she was having a rough night. Renfield nodded. He said, she's been through a lot this year. I'm glad someone was decent to her. That was it. No accusation. No joke. Just a boss who was also family being careful. But I walked back to my desk realizing something I hadn't fully registered at the party. People were watching. Not in a gossipy reality show way. In a small town, connected family way where every kindness has a witness. I spent the next 3 days waiting for something to happen. A text from Saoirse. A call from HR. A message that said stay away from my mother. Nothing came. Just silence. And silence, when you're already raw from a breakup, is its own kind of torture. On the third night, I almost broke and texted Dana something stupid. Just checking if you're okay. Then deleted it 4 times. I told myself I was protecting her. Maybe I was protecting myself. Then something else happened that I need you to hear because it explains why I said yes to coffee so fast. I ran into Saoirse at the grocery store on Franklin. Thursday evening. She was with 2 friends I didn't know. She looked good. Younger than me in every way that mattered that night. She smiled when she saw me. Not cruel. Not warm either. Just polite. She said, hey Callum. I heard you were at Renfield's party. I said, yeah, for a little while. She said, Mom said you were really nice to her. There it was. The sentence sitting in the fluorescent lights between the cereal and the bread. I said, your mom seemed like she needed a real conversation. That's all. Saoirse held my eyes for a second. Then she said, she takes a lot of photos lately. Like a lot. I think she's trying to figure out if she's still in the frame of her own life. Her friends were listening. I didn't want to perform. I said, I hope she figures it out. Saoirse nodded. She said, me too. Then she moved on down the aisle and I stood there holding a basket with one item in it like a man who had forgotten why he came. That grocery store moment did something to me. It made Dana real outside the kitchen. It made the stakes real too. This wasn't a fantasy in my head anymore. It was a mother and a daughter and a town that would talk. For days later my phone buzzed. It was a number I didn't recognize at first. Then I read the message. It was a link to a documentary. One line underneath it. Thought of this when you said that. It was Dana. I put the phone face down on my kitchen table and looked at the wall for a solid minute. Because here's what I hadn't said out loud yet. Not even to myself. I'd been thinking about that conversation every single day since the party. Not obsessively. Not in a way I could point to and say, this is a problem. Just quietly, consistently, the way a song gets into your head and you don't notice it's there until you catch yourself humming it in the grocery store. And now she was texting me. And I had no idea what to do with that. I picked the phone back up. I watched that documentary link for a long time. And then I typed back, just finished watching. You were right about the last 20 minutes. I hit send before I could think about it too hard. She replied in 4 minutes. And we texted for the next 3 hours. Not about anything that would have sounded significant to a stranger reading over our shoulders. Books, a restaurant she'd tried in Livingston that she said was worth the drive. A podcast I'd mentioned at the party. The strange, specific loneliness of Sunday evenings. Normal things. Ordinary things. The kind of things that somehow say everything. At the end of it, she asked if I wanted to get coffee that weekend. She named a place in Livingston. She said it almost casually, like it was barely a question, like it was just the obvious next sentence in a conversation that hadn't actually ended 4 days ago. I said yes. And I want to be honest with you about what I was thinking when I said yes, because this is the part where I could tell you I was completely clear-headed and rational and that I thought through every implication. But that would be a lie. The truth is I said yes because the thought of not saying yes felt like the wrong answer in a way I couldn't fully articulate. Not wrong like dangerous. Wrong like a missed turn. Like something that mattered was being offered and declining it would be the kind of decision you second-guess quietly for a long time. So, yes. Saturday. Livingston. 40 miles from Bozeman. Far enough. I got there 7 minutes early and sat in my car and thought about the fact that I was about to have coffee with my ex-girlfriend's mother and tried to figure out how to feel about that. I couldn't land on anything clean. There was the obvious complication sitting right there. Saoirse. The history. The fact that Renfield was my boss and this was his family. The age gap, 14 years, which isn't nothing. All of that was real and I'm not going to pretend it wasn't sitting in the booth with us. But here's the thing about Dana that I understood within the first 10 minutes of that coffee. She wasn't performing anything. Not ease, not casualness, not confidence. She was just there. Fully actually there, in a way that some people never manage even after years of knowing each other. She asked me questions that weren't small talk and she waited for the actual answers. She told me things about herself that I could tell she didn't usually say out loud. She told me about her marriage ending. Not the official story. The real one. 14 years. Married young, to a man she genuinely loved at the start. And then slowly, gradually, across years she could only see clearly in retrospect he'd stopped seeing her. Not cruelly. Not dramatically. Just stopped. The way a light dims so slowly you don't notice until one day you reach for the switch and realize it's been dark for a while. She'd stayed longer than she should have because she was afraid, because of Saoirse, because she kept telling herself it would come back. Didn't. The divorce was finalized 8 months before the party. She'd moved into a smaller place. She was rebuilding something, though she said she wasn't always sure what exactly she was rebuilding toward. I didn't say anything for a moment after she told me that. Then I told her about my dad. How he died when I was 19. How that had done something to my relationship with time. Made me impatient with things that felt like waiting. Made me restless with anything that didn't feel real. I told her I'd been in Bozeman for 4 years and most of it had felt like I was passing through, even though I hadn't actually gone anywhere. She looked at me like she recognized something in that. We sat in that coffee shop in Livingston for 3 hours. The place was half empty, quiet, the kind of establishment where the staff refills your cup without making it a whole thing. Nobody we knew walked through the door. We talked about everything mixed together, jumping between subjects the way conversations do when both people are paying attention. Then she said something that hit differently than everything else. She said she couldn't remember the last time she'd had a conversation that felt like it was actually going somewhere. And I understood exactly what she meant. Halfway through that 3rd hour, the barista came over and quietly said they were closing in 20 minutes. Dana looked up like she'd been underwater and just found air. She laughed and said, "We've been here so long we're becoming furniture." I said, "I'm okay with that." She went still for a second. Not uncomfortable, just aware. Then she told me something she hadn't told anyone. Not even her sister, she said. 3 weeks before the party, she'd stood in front of her bathroom mirror and practiced saying "I'm still here" out loud. She couldn't get the sentence out without crying. So she took the photos instead. 43 versions of proof that her face still existed in the world even when her marriage had made her feel invisible. I didn't touch her hand. I wanted to. I didn't because I could feel how carefully we were both treading. I said, "You're still here. I see you." She looked at me like that was the first time anyone had said it without making it sound like charity. We paid, walked out, stood in the parking lot in the cold Montana air for another 20 minutes just finishing sentences. Then the hook you don't expect in a story like this, her phone rang. She looked at the screen and her whole body changed. Tighter, older. She said, "It's my ex. I should take this." She stepped away toward the end of the lot. I couldn't hear the words, but I could see her shoulders rise and drop. When she came back, her eyes were bright in a way that wasn't happiness. She said, "He wants to finalize one last piece of paperwork in person. He said it would be easier if we were civil." I said, "Do you want to go?" She said, "I don't want to see him, but I also don't want his name on my life anymore." I said, "I'll wait in the car outside the office if you want company after." She stared at me. Then she said, "That's the most decent offer anyone has made me in 2 years." We didn't go that night, but the offer mattered. I think it mattered more than the coffee. On the drive back to Bozeman, she said, "Can I ask you something and you won't answer like you're scared?" I said, "Okay." She said, "Are you here because you feel sorry for me?" I pulled over in a turnout because I needed to look at her when I answered. I said, "No. I'm here because when you asked me if you were still beautiful, I meant what I said. And because talking to you is the first time in months, I don't feel like I'm pretending to be fine." She didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she said, "Good. Because I am not a project. I'm a person." I said, "I know." That was the night I stopped pretending this was only complicated. It was also chosen. This wasn't nothing. I knew it wasn't nothing. And that was the part that made it complicated. Because nothing was simple about this situation, and I'm not someone who lies to himself about complications. The complications were real. They had names and addresses and would have opinions if they found out. But the connection was also real. And that was real too. The following week she texted again. Same coffee place. Same Saturday. She said she thought the pie there was underrated and we should verify. I said that sounded like important research. We went. And then we went again the week after that. And by the 3rd time I walked into that coffee shop in Livingston and saw her already there, already with 2 cups on the table, already looking up with that specific expression she got when she was about to say something she'd been thinking about since we last talked. I stopped pretending to myself that this was just 2 people getting coffee. This was something. I just didn't know yet what was going to happen when the rest of the world found out. But the world almost found out early, and that's the part that still makes me sweat. It was our 4th coffee. Late February. Snow on the ground, sky the color of old steel. Dana was telling me about a book she'd read twice when the bell above the door chimed and Saoirse walked in. I swear the air left the room. She wasn't alone. She had a guy with her, tall, college-age energy, the kind of smile that assumes the room is friendly. They went to a booth by the window. Saoirse hadn't seen us yet. Or maybe she had and was pretending she hadn't. Couldn't tell. Dana went very quiet. I said, "We can leave." She said, "No. If I run every time life gets uncomfortable, I'll never stop running." So we stayed. which sounds brave in a story and felt like standing on a thin board over cold water in real life. Saoirse looked over once. Our eyes met. Hers went wide, surprise, then something sharper. She looked at Dana, looked back at me. Then she turned toward her booth and said something to the guy that made him glance our way with curiosity. 10 minutes later, she was at our table. Not yelling, not causing a scene, just standing there with her coat still on, voice low enough that only we could hear. She said, "Mom, hi. Callum. Small world." Dana said, "Hi, sweetheart." Saoirse said, "I didn't know you two came here." I said, "It's just coffee." Saoirse nodded too fast. She said, "Right. Of course. I didn't expect to see you together. That's all." Dana said, "We're friends, Saoirse. We're allowed to have coffee." The word friends landed hard. I felt it hit Dana too. Saoirse's jaw tightened. She said, "Okay. Yeah. Sorry. I didn't mean anything. It was just weird for a second." Then she walked back to her booth and I sat there thinking about every choice that had led to that table. When we left 20 minutes later, Dana was shaking slightly. Not crying. Just adrenaline leaving her body. In the parking lot, she said, "She thinks there's something here." I said, "Is there?" She looked at me. She said, "Yes, I think there is. And I'm terrified of what that costs." I said, "Me too." We stood in the cold without moving toward our cars. For a second, I thought she might kiss me. We didn't. Not because the feeling wasn't there. Because we both knew that if we crossed that line in a parking lot outside the coffee shop where her daughter had just walked in, we'd be giving the story a headline instead of a beginning. That restraint cost us something. It also saved us. A week later, someone else saw us anyway. Saoirse found out the way things always come out in places where everyone knows everyone, which is to say not from us, not directly, not in a conversation we'd prepared for. It came from a mutual acquaintance who'd seen Dana and me walking out of a place together in Livingston and mentioned it to someone in Bozeman who knew Saoirse, and by the time it got back to her, it had been filtered through 2 or 3 people, so who knows exactly what version she heard. What I know is that Dana got a phone call on a Tuesday evening. She told me about it the next day. Said it had lasted 11 minutes. Said Saoirse had been hurt, genuinely hurt, in that specific way that isn't about still loving someone romantically but about something older and more complicated. The feeling that someone who was supposed to be in your corner had moved to the other side of the room without telling you. I understood that. I didn't blame Saoirse for it. Dana didn't defend herself on the phone. She listened. She told her daughter she loved her. She said she understood why it was painful. She didn't explain or justify. She just stayed on the line until Saoirse was done. When Dana told me about it, she was sitting across from me in her kitchen, this small practical kitchen in her new apartment, and the silence afterward was the kind that has actual weight to it. She wasn't crying. She was just sitting with it. I asked her what she wanted to do. She said she wasn't going to stop, that she wanted to be clear about that. But she also wasn't going to rush anything, wasn't going to make Saoirse feel like she'd been replaced by something casual. Whatever this was between us, it was going to be handled with care. It deserved that. Saoirse deserved that. I respected that. More than respected it. We slowed down after that. Not ended. Slowed. More space between conversations. More care about where we were seen. Less like 2 people sneaking around and more like 2 people being thoughtful about something that had consequences for people they both cared about. Renfield found out about a month after Saoirse did. I don't know exactly how. My best guess is Saoirse mentioned it to someone in the family. Either way, one Monday morning he called me into his office, closed the door, sat down behind his desk, and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen on his face before. Not anger exactly. More like a man who was trying to figure out how to handle something in a professional context that was fundamentally not professional. He asked me directly if I was seeing Dana. I told him yes. I didn't elaborate. I didn't apologize. I told him it was something that happened honestly between 2 adults and that I understood if it put him in an awkward position. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he wasn't going to make it a work issue. That was his job, he said, to keep things separate. But he also made it clear that he was watching. That if anything made things difficult for Saoirse or for his family in a way that traced back to me, that would be a different conversation. I told him I understood. He nodded, said we were done. I walked out. That was on a Monday. By Wednesday, he was sending me project updates exactly like normal. By the following week, he'd made a comment in a meeting that made me laugh, and we both just continued, like it had been a squall, and now the sky was clear again. Not forgotten, but not ongoing. Those months between the conversation with Renfield and now were the hardest stretch of everything. Dana and Saoirse weren't speaking. Dana was holding that quietly, not making it dramatic, but I could see it on her some evenings. That particular kind of sadness that lives in the space between parents and children when something has broken and you don't know yet if it's the kind of break that heals. She never asked me to fix it, never implied it was my responsibility. But I thought about it constantly, because here's the thing I had to face, the thing I'd been sort of circling around for weeks without landing on it directly. This wasn't a clean situation. It was never going to be a clean situation. I hadn't walked into this with bad intentions, but intentions don't determine consequences. People I cared about were carrying things because of choices I'd made. That was real. And I had to sit with the question of whether I would have made different choices if I'd known exactly what it would cost. I sat with that for a long time. Honest answer? I don't think I would have. And I'm not saying that because the outcome justified everything or because love or whatever word you want to use covers the cost. I'm saying it because what I found in those coffee shops in Livingston, in those late-night text conversations, in Dana's kitchen sitting across from each other talking about things neither of us had said to anyone else, that was real. Genuinely, actually real, in a way I hadn't had before. And I don't think I was capable of walking away from real when I finally found it. That's the thing nobody tells you about complicated situations. They're not complicated because the people in them are reckless or stupid. They're complicated because real things are in them, and real things have weight. There was a night in March when I almost walked away from all of it. Dana had gone quiet for 2 days. Not ghosting. I could see she'd read my messages. Just silence. My brain filled the gap with every worst version. She decided it wasn't worth it. Renfield had pressured her. Saoirse had won. I was a mistake dressed up as meaning. I drove to Livingston on instinct. Stood outside her apartment building in the snow like a man in a bad country song, trying to decide if knocking was respect or pressure. Before I could, her door opened. She was in a coat and boots, keys in hand, and she froze when she saw me. She said, "How long have you been out here?" I said, 12 minutes, maybe 15. She said, "Come inside. You're freezing." Her apartment was small and warm and smelled like coffee and paper. The manuscript was on the desk under a stack of mail. She made tea. She sat across from me and said, "I owe you an apology." I said, "For what?" She said, "For going quiet. My ex showed up unannounced yesterday. He didn't come in. He stood on the sidewalk and said he missed what we had. I told him to leave. He left. And then I sat on my couch for 6 hours and couldn't text anyone because I felt like my past was knocking on every door at once. I said, "You could have told me." She said, "I know." I was ashamed that he still had that kind of power over my silence. I said, "Does he still?" She said, "No. Not after tonight. Not after you standing in the snow like an idiot because you cared enough to show up." I laughed. Came out broken. She said, "I need you to hear this clearly. I'm not going back to him. I'm not using you to get back at anyone. I'm not confused about that. What I'm confused about is how to be happy without feeling like I'm stealing happiness from my own daughter. That was the real fight. Not Renfield. Not gossip. Not even Saoirse's pain by itself. It was Dana's guilt, the oldest, heaviest kind. I said, "You're not stealing. You're living." She said, "Easy to say." I said, "I know. Say it anyway until you believe it." We talked until 2 in the morning. No romance that night. Just truth. At the door she hugged me, brief, firm, real, and said, "Stay." I stayed on her couch. She took the bedroom. In the morning she made eggs and said, I texted Saoirse. I told her I need time. I didn't tell her about you. Not yet. But I told her I'm seeing someone who makes me feel like myself again. I said, "Are you seeing me?" She looked up from the pan. She said, "Yes. If you'll still have me after how hard this has been." I said, "I'm still here." She smiled. Small. Tired. True. 2 weeks after that, Renfield invited the office to a Friday lunch downtown. Dana was there. Not as my date, just as family, standing near the window talking to his wife. At one point his wife, Helen, walked over to me while I was getting water and said, "Callum, you're a good man." She's happier. I can see it. Don't let anyone make you forget that. I didn't know what to say. Helen said, "Families are messy. Be steady. That's all anyone needs from you." That conversation didn't fix anything, but it gave me air in my lungs for another week. Then came the twist that actually moved the story forward. Dana's ex sent a certified letter. Not threatening, nothing like that. Just a final property item he'd held on to. A watch she'd thought she'd lost years ago. He included a note that said, "I should have given this back a long time ago. I'm sorry for how I made you feel small." Dana read it at my kitchen table and cried for the first time in front of me. Not because she wanted him back. Because closure always arrives dressed like something you didn't know you were still carrying. She said, "If he can close his chapter, I can close mine." The next day she texted Saoirse, "Can we try lunch? Just us. No cayum. No speeches. I miss you." Saoirse took 3 days to answer. Then she said yes. They met for lunch the following weekend, 4 months after that first painful phone call, but only days after Dana had finally asked. Dana told me about it that evening. She came over and sat at my kitchen table, which had somehow become a thing we did, and she said it had been hard and awkward and that Saoirse had cried at some point and so had she, and that nothing was resolved exactly but something had been reopened. A door that had been shut was cracked now. She said Saoirse had asked her one question that she couldn't stop thinking about. She asked, "Are you actually happy?" And Dana had told her yes. Saoirse had looked at her for a long moment and then said she wanted to believe that. That was where it stood. It's been 14 months now since a party in Bozeman, Montana, where a woman I barely knew showed me a photo on her phone and asked me something that took 3 seconds to answer. Dana's divorce has been final for over a year. She's living fully on her own terms for the first time in a long time, and I watch what that does to a person. The way they start to expand back into themselves when the pressure that was on them is gone. She'd started writing again, something she'd stopped doing mid-marriage, and there's a half-finished manuscript that sits on the desk in the corner of her apartment that she works on most mornings before anything else. She doesn't talk about it much yet, but she's writing it. Saoirse and Dana aren't back to where they were. Maybe they won't be for a while, but they're talking. That's real and it's something, and I'm not going to minimize it by calling it more than what it is. Renfield and I are fine. Professional. Occasionally something approaching actual. And Dana and I are still figuring out what we are, exactly, in the way that you do when two people come together under complicated circumstances and decide to do it carefully instead of quickly. There's no neat label yet. There's just us showing up, being honest with each other, taking it at the pace it actually needs to go. I think about that night at the party sometimes. The 43 photos. The way she asked that question so quietly, like she was almost embarrassed to need the answer. And I think about what would have happened if I'd given her the easy answer instead of the true one. Or if I'd drifted somewhere else in the kitchen and she'd never shown me the photo at all. I don't believe in much that's too big to hold. But I do think some conversations are load-bearing. Like they're holding something up that you didn't know was being held. That one was. And I'm still living inside what it built. If this story stayed with you even a little, I'd really love it if you subscribed. I'm going to keep telling stories like this. Real ones. The kind that don't clean themselves up at the end.
Thank you for watching this video all the way to the end. Drop a comment, tell me where in the world you were watching from, and if you have a real story that stayed with you, share it below in the comments. I will turn it into a next video.